So this meeting today is primarily going to be focused around health policies, guidelines, and health-related issues with policy implications for the return to the school year. Our first agenda item however, is going to be approval of the minutes from the policy subcommittee meeting of June 14th. Have members had an opportunity to review the minutes? All right, would you like to move the minutes, Andy?
I would, yes.
Okay, I'll second. Andy?
Yes.
Valerie?
Same.
And I also vote yes. I also want to welcome our newest school committee member, Ms. Valerie Frias. Congratulations. This is her first policy subcommittee meeting.
Thank you.
All right, so let's jump right in. The first topic of conversation today is going to be the face mask policy. As many of you may recall, we had approved a face coverings policy at the beginning of the last school year. And then at our final school committee meeting of the last academic year, we voted to rescind that policy, in part because a lot of the procedures in place were no longer matching up with what the policy had, and also just based on changes on what was taking place in the community with the pandemic, we felt that perhaps we could loosen those restrictions. However, with the Delta variant, of course, it looks like we're going to need to bring that policy back. And procedurally, that process begins here at the subcommittee level. We are joined today by Dave Gayshock, who of Panel 4. Panel 4 has been meeting regularly to provide updated recommendations to the school district about what some of the most sensible guidelines might be for us to adopt. So Dave, would you like to summarize for us the work that Panel 4 has been doing over the summer and what those recommendations are regarding face masks?
Yeah, happy to, David. Thank you. I think Panel 4 has met a few times in July and August so far. We're meeting basically bi-weekly at this point. Our next meeting is going to be a week from tomorrow. We have basically done a recap of last year's experience and set of mitigation measures for Dr. Guillory and other incoming members of the administration, and then have started to look forward to what should be on tap for this year. I think we have a working set of recommendations, no formal votes yet, just given that there are a lot of moving parts out there with the bodies of evidence and state and national guidance that we're drawing from, in addition to members' own experience. So happy to go through any of those that the subcommittee would like, but they largely amount to, we are at this point recommending in line with CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics, universal indoor masking be continued in PSB for the beginning of the school year, subject to ongoing reassessment and revision as we see how the school year goes. I think that panel members are hopeful that there will be a basis during the school year, and hopefully potentially even early on in the school year, that policy or recommendation can be revisited, and there'll be a way forward that doesn't require universal indoor masking. But for the moment, given where we are with Delta, vaccination eligibility, vaccination levels, the panel's recommendation is that masks be worn by all students and staff, regardless of vaccination status, while indoors, subject to the exceptions of reasonably limited eating times as needed, and other mask breaks, similar to last year. I think we can get into those exceptions in as much detail as would be helpful. Outside, the recommendation, consistent again with broader guidance, is that masks not be required as a matter of course, but there may be instances where folks, particularly unvaccinated students or staff, are in close enough proximity outside for extended periods of time. So not playing on the playground, but sitting in a tightly packed group for an extended period of time where There may be special cases where masking outside makes more sense. But as a general matter, universal indoor masking and very limited outdoor masking, the default rule being not required, would be our recommendation. Happy to answer questions or get into any more detail that the subcommittee would like.
All right, thank you very much, Dave. Do subcommittee members have any questions for Dave at this time? All right, seeing none, I'd like to ask Tricia Laham or Casey if you have any comments to make on behalf of the district and what the district is currently thinking around masking requirements.
I will jump in and Casey can as well. I agree and support what Dave has recommended, universal masking for all staff and students to start the school year inside the buildings. And that is consistent with what Dr. Jett has advised for public buildings in the town as well.
Thanks, Tricia. I just want to clarify, Dave, if you don't mind, that the recommendation from panel 4 is for all PSB students, including BEEP.
Correct. All PSB students, including BEEP, obviously with individualized accommodations as needed, be fully supportive of making accommodations as appropriate in those situations. But yes, down to BEEP. I think the CDC and AAP guidance is anyone above the age of 2, and I think that we're close to that, if not right on that, with BEEP students as well. So rather than trying to draw lines for a very small group of BEEP students, our recommendation is just go universal.
Thank you.
And Dave, these universal recommendations would also apply to staff and administration, is that correct?
Correct. Anyone inside buildings, again, with similar practical exceptions to last year, right? Someone working alone in a non-shared office space, would, I think the general understanding is that that person would be free to take his or her or their mask off during that period of time where they're not sharing space with anybody else, either in real time or sequentially. But otherwise, yes, that would apply regardless of category of stakeholder, regardless of age, regardless of vaccination status for the moment, subject to taking another look, at the end of September and as the fall goes on to see how the evidence is shaping up.
Andy?
Yeah, could I ask Tricia and Casey, so possibly the simplest thing we could do at this point is to resurrect last year's face mask policy and just change it so that it applies only to indoors and not outdoors. To having lived with that policy last year, was there anything there that you thought was poorly drafted or misconceived that we should take the opportunity to change?
I don't think so. I don't have the policy in front of me. I liked last year's policy. People with a medical reason were allowed to get that exemption, and the only exception being outdoor time. So I was happy with last year's policy.
Agreed. I don't think we had too much issue with implementation. I think Regina from BEEP would say that even down to our youngest learners, there was no problem with compliance with regard to mask wearing. Of course, we had some exceptions and we worked with those individual cases, but otherwise, I think that the existing or last year's policy was pretty successful.
Can I add one other piece of context, which one of the things that panel 4 sees as a benefit of doing this is, for the moment, our recommendation is that a fully masked classroom should, in our view, allow the district to fully relax distancing within a fully masked classroom, such that our recommendation would be that in that fully masked setting, that educators be free to arrange their classrooms in whatever manner they think is most appropriate, for pedagogical and other purposes. So that's one benefit here, that masking would, would serve to fill that need, and we could put less emphasis on distancing.
There are some community members who brought to my attention that for younger students in particular, and also students in language classes, that there are some benefits to being able to see the teacher vocalizing. Has there been any thought toward having translucent masks or face shields in those situations?
We had some translucent masks last year with varying degrees of success and ease of use, but we can try those for students. The barrier is good, but it's not the same as a mask. We did make exceptions to students at times if we needed to, but I think the mask is a separate mitigating strategy that works differently than a shield would be.
I'm thinking more along the lines of educators. So for example, so that our students would be able to see educators' lips moving while they're vocalizing words, especially in language classes or for our younger students. This is just an issue that's been raised with me by multiple community members.
You know, I think that we can talk about some situations where teachers, some teachers didn't like the translucent masks. They were hot, they may have fogged up. There were some things that were less useful about it than we thought they would be. In terms of the shield in that setting, I think in particular cases, we can look at that and make exceptions. And in that case, I would say we'd want to refocus on distancing.
Okay, are there any other general thoughts before we revisit the policy language? Susan?
Good. Thank you so much. Thank you to panel 4, as always, Dave and Trisha and Casey for your thoughts and guidance here. I do think that the only other thing I would say is that the communication piece of this is really critical, because I think there were a few concerns about, number one, what message does it send if we are asking for masks for vaccinated children and staff? And I think just being clear about, the public health guidance around that is important, while still making it very clear that vaccination is the number one most important thing that we all need to be driving towards whenever possible, unless there's a medical reason not to. So I do think that there's when we communicate this in very, very simple language, something that says this is the right answer given the public health guidance that we have as we begin the school year. We will regularly revisit it, but for now, this fully mask setting, as Dave said, is critical to relaxing distancing, and masking is just one of many measures. The most important being vaccination. Second most important is keeping students and staff home and symptomatic. Third is identification of and testing of close contacts. Masking works in concert with a number of the other pieces like ventilation and hand washing and whatnot. So, and that people with a medical reason can get an exemption. So I just think that we have to be very, very simple and succinct about our messaging. It was a really rich conversation at panel 4, and that we've had over the last number of months, and just given all the changes, I think it's important, and all the different choices that families have been making, I think it's important that whatever the policy ends up being, that the communication be very in as few words as possible, but succinct and simple around this, and that we work and that there's sort of a special education lens to this as well for students who may struggle with this, that be a conversation that for in whatever way needed, so that the students can still access education, that parents have concerns, they should talk with their team about that.
Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to just emphasize, I think, what Dave and Susan have already said, maybe, which is that I think in our thinking and in our messaging, like keeping masking is bound up with our ability to eliminate distancing in the classroom, which is a big step forward for instruction and mental health. So, and nobody likes that we have to wear masks, but it enables this other wonderful thing that we're going to do now that we couldn't do in the spring.
All right, any more thoughts, or shall we dive right into the language? Okay, seeing
Add one more thing, David,
Go ahead,
which
Dave.
is, I think as folks are hoping to shed masks over the course of the year, I want to emphasize vaccination is the path to do that. A big piece of that is out of our hands for the moment in terms of vaccination at ages 11 and below. Hopefully that is going to change during the course of the school year. The best way that we can set ourselves up to have flexibility on masking come later in the fall or in the winter, or certainly in the spring, is by continuing to encourage everyone who possibly can to get vaccinated. We think as far as we can tell, we think that about 85% ballpark of eligible PSB students, as well as Brookline residents, are fully vaccinated. But the closer we can get that to 100% and then extend it down to lower age levels when FDA approval comes through, the easier it's going to be to drop masking requirements, during the course of the school year.
And I just want to jump in with a clarification. Our electronic health record system is a little challenging. I think our student percentage is lower than we had thought. It's probably around 70% is what I think. Given from the information that we have from the MIIS, Massachusetts Immunization Registry. We are offering a vaccine clinic next week and hope to capture more of those students. Many more students have had one vaccine than the full set.
Trisha, that's of the eligible, right? Not of the full population?
Correct, of the eligible.
I will note, just the last thing I'll say is that there obviously has been a robust conversation about whether or not vaccinations will be a policy or required. So just to name that as part of the panel 4 conversation as well, probably not for today, but just it's out there.
All right, so why don't we turn now to the policy. There are 2 policies that members should have access to right now. So one of them is the updated MASC template policy that was most recently updated on August 10th, so just a couple days ago. And the other one is the policy that we had in place last year. For those of you who've had an opportunity to review both policies, you'll see that they are quite similar to one another. However, our policy was actually significantly more detailed, and given the input that we just received from Trisha, as well as Dave and Casey, I think it would make sense to work off of the policy that we already had. Now, I did hear that one change that is being recommended is that we're a little looser about masking outdoors. So if I can turn your attention to the second page of the policy we had last year, at the very top of the page, last year's policy said, during certain outdoor activities in physical education classes and extracurricular activities at the discretion of PSB educators or staff. That was listed as an exception to masking. I would suggest that we reduce that bullet point to just during certain outdoor activities at the discretion of PSB educators or staff. Would that be acceptable to members? Andy says yes. What are your thoughts, Valerie?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll make that edit. Then really the only other issue I think with the policy was we ended up in a difficult position last year in the sense that, go ahead, Andy.
Well, while we're on the topic of changing the scope of the policy, in the second paragraph on the first page, I think we need to change that as well. Because right now it says that you have to wear a mask in school buildings, on school grounds, on school transportation, and at school-sponsored activities. Maybe, I mean, we still want it for school buildings and school transportation, but not necessarily grounds and all activities. Right?
So how about we add their indoors on school grounds to that portion?
Is that any different from school buildings?
No, I suppose it's not. So I guess we could take that out.
Yeah. And I think now the all school activities is also a bit too broad because some of those take place outdoors. So I think having it just be within buildings only, I think takes care of it, right? Along with transportation.
Okay. Valerie, do you agree with those changes?
I agree with those. I just had a clarifying question on transportation for Dave. Did panel 4 make any other recommendations regarding transportation that were different from last year?
No, we haven't. And my understanding is that, at least for face covering purposes, all of our hands are tied by federal rules on that front, no matter what any of us think. So
Okay.
I think that, I mean, transportation with masking and particularly with windows open is, I think, pretty well demonstrated to be quite safe at low risk at this point. But the masking mandate there, I think, is still federal policy.
Thank you.
One reason we might want to consider having it as indoors on school grounds, which just popped into my mind, and we'll talk about this later on in the agenda. Some of the entry and arrival and dismissal guidelines that were implemented last year include having students gather right outside different front doors. And when they're in that position, they're closely crowded together, and we may want them masking during those times, even though they're outside. So I just wonder whether that's something that's worth including in the policy, or we think that could be covered regardless.
That might fall under the what's left of the third bullet point that we just dealt with. It's an outdoor activity at the discretion of school staff, whether they want people to be masked to them.
Okay. All right. And then one other issue that we had discussed at a full school committee meeting, our last one in June, was whether to add a clause that allows the superintendent to have the discretion to modify or suspend one or more of these provisions without necessarily going to the school committee for a vote. Is that something we would like to include, or do we want to just be more vigilant about ensuring that any departures from policy be voted on?
I think vigilance. I mean, I think Dave and panel 4 are doing a great job of communicating, and the superintendent has been attending. And I think that all of us working together is probably still the best way to go for now. We can revisit that again as Dave's revisiting masking and things, but from my perspective, I'd be more comfortable not making that change right now.
Okay. Andy, Susan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think if circumstances change and it makes sense to relax the mask policy, I mean, the school committee can move pretty fast on that. I think we can get it done within a week, which is, I think, a reasonable time frame for something like that. So I don't worry about leaving the policy as it is.
Okay. All right, so in that case, we've made 2 changes. So just to review those changes again, on the first page, second paragraph, it now reads, a face covering that completely covers the nose and mouth must be worn by all individuals in school buildings and on school transportation, even when social distancing is observed. Face coverings must fit snugly against the sides of the face, secured with ties or ear loops. Gaiters, balaclavas, bandanas, and coverings with valves are prohibited. And then on the second page, the bullet point on the top of the page, which was a list of exceptions to masking, would only read now, during certain outdoor activities at the discretion of PSB educators or staff. Susan?
Sorry, we lost power, so I couldn't get back on. But I am wondering if we need to say something about any indoors at any school activity, because there are going to be other events like athletic activities or visiting other schools for intramural clubs or whatever it is. So I'm wondering if it has to be any school activity or PSB sponsored activity, however you want to say that.
Do you mean, Susan, like a PSB activity that's not taking, an indoor PSB activity that's not taking place within a PSB building?
So why don't we just bring back then the and at school sponsored activities? I think that's what covered that category last year. Would that be sufficient?
We just have to specify that those are indoor activities.
All right, so and at indoor school sponsored activities. Although my one worry about specifying indoor in that context is if it's at an event that's somewhere else, we don't necessarily have control over what restrictions that other venue might have. And then we would be potentially conflicting with what that other venue wanted.
How about at a minimum, I mean, because I do think that if they're at a school which is like a no mask school, with respect, I think we still want our kids masked. And so I think maybe if they have more stringent restrictions, we wouldn't want to run afoul of that. But I don't think we'd want to go less. Is that what you're saying? Is that consistent with what you're saying, David?
Well, I think I'm sort of saying the reverse, that if for whatever reason, where our students were going, that other venue wanted everyone to be masked, including outdoors, I wouldn't want there to be a conflict between our policy and the intentions of that other venue.
Great. No, then I'm 100% agreeing with you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think you're both saying the same thing, and I agree as well, that this should be the floor, not the ceiling.
So then just have it as, and at a minimum indoor, or how do we want to precisely word that one? And at school sponsored activities.
Can we just add a clause that says, in addition thereto, if a host school district's policy requires something greater than provided herein, PSB students and staff shall abide thereto, something like that. Sorry, there are a lot of theretos in that.
Or maybe whichever is stricter, right? Or just state our policy and then say, if they're at a school sponsored event, at any other school sponsored event where there is more, I don't know what the word is, conservative, more strict,
Yeah.
whatever, we're following the one, whichever is more conservative, whichever is more strict.
See, just trying to figure out how to phrase that. I think Andy's suggestion probably kept it the simplest of just stating indoors is ours. And then if the other place has another restriction, we would fall under that policy, I suppose, if they wanted to also have masking outdoors.
Casey's got a hand up. She may have a suggestion.
You could say something simple, that we would respect and adhere to stricter guidelines at host schools.
Yeah, host venues. Yeah, I like that, Tricia.
So something like, in the event that, let's see, now I can't read my own handwriting. I'm sorry, Tricia, do you mind repeating that again?
I said that we would respect and adhere to stricter guidelines at host school venues.
I throw a suggestion, David, to simplify.
Sure.
You state your policy and then just say, to the extent a PSB activity is hosted at a non-PSB venue with more stringent controls, or stricter controls, the stricter controls will apply.
All right, so to the extent a PSB activity is hosted at a non-PSB venue, these stricter controls will apply. I like that. No, Andy?
Yeah, maybe the wordsmithing can be done offline. It's clear what we intend. Yeah, so.
Okay, I'm just hoping though that we can vote to recommend approval of the policy at the full school committee. So that's why I'm just trying to get that done now.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, can we say something like if a host venue has a stricter policy, then we'll abide by that?
right, I like how Dave's was phrased. Maybe instead of controls, it could be rules or something like that. So that's a little
Sure.
clearer. Is that okay with you, Valerie? So the sentence would read, to the extent a PSB activity is hosted at a non-PSB venue, the stricter rules will apply.
Yes.
To the extent seems a little, can we just say if?
All
Yeah,
right, sure. If a PSB,
That's actually what bothered me before, not the other
Okay.
differences.
if a PSB activity is hosted at a non-PSB venue, the stricter rules will apply.
Great, thanks, Dave.
David, can I interrupt and go back a few minutes? I'm sorry if I missed this while I was getting in my car. There was mention about arrival and dismissal procedures. I just wanted to make sure the language that we landed on that allows for, so long as students and staff are masked, that we can, we don't have to split up the entryways like we did last year, unless panel 4 is recommending that we continue that practice.
I haven't discussed that specifically, but my sense is that we've put significantly less emphasis over the course of the year on cohort separation, and are also thinking of the universal masking policy as thereby not requiring distance in addition. So the combination of those two things, I suspect panel 4, if asked, would say that certainly no particular need to stick with onerous arrival procedures that are that otherwise you'd prefer to get rid of.
But Casey, you're
Great.
suggesting that we clarify that masking should take place there? You'd feel more comfortable if we explicitly stated that masking should take place?
I think so. And I think about implementation and just operations of the schools as principals are thinking about arrival and dismissal procedures. I want to take the onus off of the principals so that they're more focused on getting the kids into the building. So as much as the committee can clarify for them, I think the better.
So I would suggest then following Casey's suggestion and adding that as an outdoor exception to the general rule.
Given the number of unanticipated permutations of what might be an outdoor specific exception like this, you may just want to give either the superintendent or building principals discretion to direct that masks will be used outside of, when specifically directed by the building leader or otherwise. And that
I
can
think
be
Casey's idea was wanting to take the burden of that off of the building.
Off of principals.
Well, it sounds like we need to, there's a recommendation that we add a line somewhere saying that masks shall be worn outdoors during arrival and dismissal procedures. Is that what you're looking for, Casey? Or is my understanding correct? That's what Casey was looking for?
Yes, that's my,
so.
yes.
The mask will be in place upon arrival to school and not removed until, I don't know. I don't think we have to say dismissal. That's less of an issue.
Yeah.
I think if the goal is to do away with the very regimented outside requirement, it sounded like Casey's intent was, this starts to look a lot more like recess. and you probably end up with a situation where people put their masks on before they walk in the door. And I think panel 4 would be just fine with that, is my suspicion.
So maybe add something like to that, in the second paragraph, first sentence, a face covering that completely covers the nose and mouth must be worn by all individuals upon arrival to school buildings, on school transportation, and the rest? Or do we need to specify outdoor? Right now, it just says must be worn by all individuals at school buildings. So changing, adding in upon arrival to school buildings. Is that sufficient, or does it need to expressly mention arriving on school grounds?
I don't think we have to say on school grounds, because if they got to school a little bit early and were outside before school, I don't think they need to have their mask on. So I think upon arrival to the school building.
Okay, so why don't we change that first sentence then to a face covering that completely covers the nose and mouth must be worn by all individuals upon arrival to school buildings, school transportation, and school-sponsored activities, even when social distancing is observed. And then we have that other sentence, mostly wordsmithed by Dave. If a PSB activity is hosted at a non-PSB venue, the stricter rules will apply.
At a non-PSB venue with stricter rules.
Stricter rules will apply at the non-PSB venue. Okay.
Or just if it's at a non-PSB venue with stricter rules, those stricter rules apply.
Okay. All right, any other suggested modifications?
David, the one other thing you may want to take into account is you've got, I think, at least the version I have has an in accordance with guidance from CDC, DESE, et cetera, at the beginning.
Yes.
Barring a change from DESE, which I wouldn't be surprised by, you're right now going stricter, and I think appropriately so, than DESE for vaccinated individuals. And so you may, I'm not sure if that merits a modification to the beginning, but just in case someone comes back and says, if you're in accordance with DESE, I don't have to wear a mask because I'm vaccinated.
Well, that's a good point. Thank you. So how about we switch the word accordance to in consultation? Would that be sufficient to panel members? All right. Any other suggested changes? All right, seeing none, would someone like to move that we recommend that we refer this policy to the full school committee? Thank you, Andy. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Valerie. Andy?
Yes.
Valerie? Your vote? I see Valerie nodding her head yes, and
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And I also vote yes. All right, thank you very much. So now moving on to our next topic, health-related issues with policy implications. So I'll again turn to you, Dave, if you would like to sort of discuss what else panel 4 is considering with respect to potential health concerns and safeguards. And then I'll ask Tricia and Casey your thoughts about the policy implications for us and what we may need to do as a subcommittee in terms of codifying any new guidelines or rules. Go ahead, Dave.
Sure. So covered masks, just want to put another plug for vaccination. Everyone, please, 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 if you're not vaccinated, your age eligible kids are not vaccinated, please get vaccinated. Ventilation, just continuing the enhanced levels and approach from last year, we think is appropriate. Distancing, we've talked a little bit about in the fully masked classroom to give educators flexibility and not worry about interpersonal distancing for the moment in fully masked settings. The lunch snack, other indoor mask breaks is a little bit trickier, and we've kind of moved in our thinking a little bit over the last few weeks, given the rise of Delta. And so I know this has significant operational implications, but the current working consensus view of the panel is that there should be some degree of minimum seat distancing for indoor eating operations, at least at the unvaccinated grade level. So that'd be, pre-K through 6 as a general rule for the moment are too young to be vaccinated. And so we're recommending a 3-foot minimum seat distancing there. We understand that that's a big lift for PSB, but that's what the sense of the panel was based upon the evidence available about a week ago. The sense of the panel members there was that that was not necessary for older grades, which we think are more significant, which are age eligible for vaccination, and as Tricia noted, have a fairly high degree of vaccination coverage. I think that that's not a universal view of the panel, but that's the significant majority view for the moment. And then just limiting unmasked indoor time as much as reasonably possible. Folks have to have enough time to eat a healthy lunch, obviously, and sometimes there are going to be some other indoor times that require mask breaks, but limiting that as much as possible. And I want to stress for meal operations, as much as possible being outside. The more that can happen outside, the better. So we still have to take a look into special indoor situations like vocal and wind instrumental music, potentially PE. So those are still on our agenda to be covered. And I think what that leaves is the constellation of testing, symptom screening, staying home when sick, and contact tracing, isolation, quarantine. And those are all kind of interrelated pieces of the who's, where, when, and for how long, based upon status piece. There's new DESI and DPH guidance and program offerings, I think, that have come out as recently as within the last day or two, that Tricia is probably much closer to than I am at this point, so I defer to her. The panel left its in-depth discussion of testing and contact tracing and quarantine requirements until those were available, and so that will happen at our next panel meeting. And then the general sense is that symptom screening, stay home when sick, we'll take another look at the symptoms list and try to tie that into some testing availability in order to minimize the amount of time that folks are excluded from being in buildings for symptoms that turn out not to be COVID. So that's what's on our forthcoming agenda. I think the thing to end with is that every one of the pieces of guidance, CDC, American Academy of Pediatrics, DESI, DPH, et cetera, all start from the premise of maximize in-person time for students this year, and the importance from both an educational and a socio-emotional perspective. So we're really looking at all these things with an eye toward not compromising safety, but not creating artificial barriers to students being in buildings. And also stressing to BSB that given the lack of an ongoing remote or hybrid option, it's important that students who for any reason are quarantined or otherwise excluded from school for any period of time have robust connection available to them from an educational and social perspective, both for their own needs and also because that'll better incentivize people to actually follow whatever the rules and guidelines are at that point, rather than cut corners. So that's the high level of where we are. Happy to get into more detail if anyone would like on any of that. Casey.
All right, thank you. Casey, what?
Yeah, Dave, did the panel have any recommendations regarding time limits for when students are unmasked and eating at, the 3-foot distance?
Not specifically. This is not going to be precise down to minutes. I think, whatever kind of our minimum time frame is for giving people a legitimate, reasonable chance to actually eat a healthy lunch,
Okay.
I don't think the panel has any basis to change that, right? The CDC close contact rule was, for whatever one thinks the actual precision is worth, was 15 minutes. Now with Delta, one could argue that theoretically should be even shorter, maybe. I just don't think we have data to say that 12 minutes is okay, but 15's borderline and 18's too much. I think it's whatever, outside as much as possible, and then when inside, limiting the amount of time as much as reasonably possible that students have masks off. But there isn't a magic number.
Okay, that's helpful. I'm just thinking again in terms of implementation, as principals are thinking, once the full committee, if the full committee votes for when masks are off and we're indoors, a minimum of 3 feet distancing, they'll have to reconfigure, I imagine, at least at some of our schools, the seating in cafeterias. And so I'm sure they're wondering also for principals, do we have to adjust times for the lunch blocks too?
Yeah,
So
the 3-foot
thank you.
distancing is probably in every other seat, unfortunately, at our given cafeteria tables, based upon the measurements we took last year. So it's probably about a 50% total capacity within my guess, thereabout.
Okay, thank you.
All right, now, one of those items that you mentioned in particular, Dave, contact tracing and quarantining students. It's been brought to my attention from members of the school community that they want to know how attendance will function for students who are deemed contacts and have to quarantine for a certain period of time. I know that there's going to be a push for quarantine students to be as actively involved as possible with school-related activities from their homes while they're quarantining. And thus we may need to reconsider how we mark them in terms of whether they're present, whether they're absent, whether it's an excused absence, how we want to handle that. And to the extent that it might be able to ease the burden on principals and educators to have this spelled out in a policy, I think it would be helpful to have some understanding from you, Casey, and others as to what it is that you would like to see.
I think we had guidance from DESE last year to say that for students who are quarantining, I think we were allowed to mark them virtually present. I'll have to get back to you on that, but I would just need to confirm.
Okay. Given that we're not going to have a remote learning academy this year, do you think the virtually present option would still be applicable?
I think I can't see why not. One thing that senior staff were discussing just earlier this week was what we would be providing students in terms of an education for those who are quarantining. So if they are actively engaging, I can't imagine that we wouldn't mark them, that it's an excused, it wouldn't even be an excused absence, that they would be present in some way.
Okay.
And one of the things that we are looking at is a test to stay in school. So a lot of the close contacts will be tested daily, probably for 5 days to allow them to stay in school. So while we anticipate in some situations more close contacts because of the shrunken distance, those students will, to the extent possible, stay in school because we're testing them daily. That means asymptomatic students would stay in school. So fewer kids hopefully will be out on quarantine.
Susan?
I wonder if it's worth just sort of listening to this conversation, the panel 4 conversation. I'm wondering if it's worth, Casey, as the senior leadership team and the principals talk about this, and if we know what the major categories are going to be. So let's say there's an extended period of time where, at the most extreme, where let's say there's a vulnerable or a immunocompromised family member, or the student's immunocompromised, or for whatever reason, there's sort of an extended period, not just a quarantine, when the student has to be out. That's one set of scenarios. Another one is if it's a quarantine, and another one is just if they're, well, there's Trisha's scenario, which I know is going to be quite common, and then they're symptomatic, right? They've got the sniffles for 3-4 days. They can't miss 3 or 4 days of education because they may or may not be virtually present. I don't know what the plan is for Zoom or whatnot during those periods, but I think if it starts to feel like a trade-off, just as David was saying, then parents are going to be more likely to send their kids to school on day 3. And again, obviously they would hopefully have a test by then, but even if they don't, I think it would be helpful maybe to say, like, here are the kinds of scenarios that we're envisioning. If it's like 1 or 2 days, what it would look like versus if it's 14 days or more. I'm just wondering if that would be helpful at all, because it may be the same answer. Ideally, it would be the same answer, just because it's simpler than to try to come up. You can't come up with an individual plan for every student in every situation. So I guess it would be helpful to maybe sort of think about some like use cases, like real life cases. And what we
Yeah,
would do.
that's a helpful suggestion. I'll bring that back to senior staff. I mean, it's a very active conversation, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, again, we can't expect teachers to have like full plan, you know what I mean? Like full, every single student having their own set of things. And so whatever we can do to make that as, I don't know, as consistent as possible or standard as possible, so they don't have to be trying to customize too much.
Yeah, one of the pieces we also talked about too that Leslie Ryan Miller brought up is the importance of keeping up with the learning management systems. I don't know to what extent we'll be asking teachers to use them. So this is Seesaw. Am I saying? I'm trying to remember them now.
Google Classroom.
Not that long ago, right?
Yes.
And Canvas, right?
Yes, Seesaw, Google Classroom, and Canvas.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So there's some continuity there. That's whether you're in person or virtually, you can still access something there. So we'll have that, which is good.
Right. I would have assumed that would be a minimum, but maybe that I shouldn't have assumed that. We finally got everyone using the LMSs, so. Okay, well, it's a different conversation, I guess. But the policy might change in terms of whether or not we're marking them virtually present. If they're not zooming into a classroom, I don't know if we can mark them virtually present. I think that was part of.
Right.
That was part of marking them present. And if we're not marking them present, and we have fairly strict policies around attendance, like our policy manual, a couple years ago about attendance is fairly strict, especially at the high school. And like you can't do like there are penalties to missing too many days. And in fact, we actually want to encourage people to stay home. I just want to make sure we're not setting up cross incentives. So whatever Desi says will be helpful. Sorry. I'm not even a member of your committee, David. Sorry.
No, I appreciate it. I was just going to second the remarks you just made. I think it's very important that we do not want to create a disincentive for students to accurately report that they're experiencing symptoms because they do not want to suffer the adverse consequences of being marked absent. So I think it's critically important that we have something in place that would allow us to mark students who are at home quarantining or waiting for test results so that they can be actively participating and have full access to education or as much as possible. That's obviously important in and of itself. And then secondly, just to ensure that they're not, in a sense, being punished for having come forward about experiencing symptoms or being in a situation where they were at close contact and have to quarantine. We want to encourage transparency around this.
If I can jump in, David, I just want to underscore that and also say that my sense is that we will be recommending to the superintendent and the broader decision-making team whatever we can that DESE and DPH contact tracing and local health department contact tracing will support in terms of ability to, whether it's test and stay or other similar programs, to minimize the amount of time that folks have to spend outside of school for those reasons. But we absolutely want to reinforce the fact that whatever that bottom line is, we want the incentive to be to report honestly and follow those guidelines rather than cut corners.
So then another issue that's been brought to my attention where we may want a policy. So we were talking earlier about arrival and dismissal, but there are also after school programs, whether it's gathering to go to an athletic practice or some other after school program that we have in our buildings. And we may want to have a policy in place, again, to take the burden off of principals from not really knowing how to handle some of these questions. It can simplify it for them potentially. If there's some kind of very clear set of procedures for how we get students to after-school programs within buildings in such a way that might not necessitate parents having to come in or others into the building if we're looking to minimize how many people come into the buildings. So I'm just wondering if any thought has been given to that, Casey or Tricia.
We haven't discussed it actually, but I mean, it's a good question that we should have answers for, because like you said, we do have students who transition at the K-8s from their regular day down or wherever to the extended day classroom. So what are we asking of extended day programs? And then at the high school, of course, too, when they're transitioning. I think that's what you're asking, or at least one of the questions you're asking, right, David?
It is, yes. Do you think it would be helpful if we had a policy in place for transitioning, whether, especially to extended day programs?
Is that not
Well,
covered by indoor activities in a building already by the current policy?
Perhaps in part, but because extended day is technically a separate entity, there may be instances where sometimes parents or guardians are entering the building in order to take the students to the classroom. And right now that seems to function differently at each school as to how kids actually arrive at the classrooms for extended day.
But if they're entering the building, then the policy covers it.
I think at risk of jumping in where I'm not needed, I think David's talking about something beyond just masking.
Oh, well, sorry, then could you explain what are the other issues here that we might have to address?
Just whether we want to be letting others into the building who are not students, whether.
Oh, that. Right, so last year we just had a strict no visitors policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if we're going to have a no visitors policy, and I would think that I'm inclined to agree with that, how do we handle our younger students getting to extended day or other programs? Sometimes what happens is the extended day staff will go to each classroom to pick up each student. That's not always necessarily practical, though, depending on where the students are, especially since they're coming from many parts of the building, or maybe they were outside of the building. So do we want to designate certain gathering spots? Do we want to have everyone enter through a certain door? Does someone greet them at that door?
Is this
I would
an area where a one size fits all kind of policy from the school committee would be better than just letting the principals and extended day directors figure it out on the ground?
Well, just an open question, because sometimes we hear that principals would actually like to see something codified, because then they're very easy sets of guidelines for them to follow. Other times it can be interpreted as infringing on their autonomy, which of course we don't want to do either. So it's more about how we can be most helpful.
I think that the broader masking policy while indoors is helpful regardless of how kids transition to and from extended day. I just lost my train of thought. What was it? And then I think the other policy that would be helpful to have a decision made, so for to take it again off the onus off the principals, is visitors.
Okay, so currently that's being decided by each individual school, at least traditionally. There was a set of procedures that were implemented toward the end of last year where visitors were, I think, excluded across the board, but generally it's been a school by school determination, correct?
That's right.
Was it ever a school committee policy, the exclusion of visitors last year?
I don't remember. I mean, we
Yeah.
definitely had a no visitors policy, but I don't know what process it went through, if any, to be honest.
I think so. Superintendent Marini had sent out a communication essentially outlining this procedure. So it wasn't a formal policy that we took, but it may be helpful for us to devise one. And this
That
has
would be helpful.
And this has
principals.
broader implications, of course, even beyond health related, although we're looking at this through a health related lens today. This is an issue that comes up in the context of security as well.
And time on learning. I think teachers would say fewer parents in the building early in the morning this past year really increased their ability to start and have classes running quickly early on.
I guess, Casey, I don't know if you're able to talk about parent-teacher meetings, IEP meetings, what the thinking is around Zoom for those types of meetings going forward?
So we do have permission from DESE to continue running IEP meetings virtually. I'm not sure about parent-teacher conferences. My guess is that can be a local decision. So if we had a no visitor policy, obviously IEP meetings and such could still be run.
All right. Are there any other thoughts about any of these health-related issues that might necessitate a policy? Any other areas that have not yet been identified, or any further thoughts on subjects that have already been raised? All right, not seeing any. Are there any members of the public who would like to opine on anything we've discussed today? If you would, if you can raise your virtual hand, I can promote you to join us. All right, I'm not seeing any.
Okay. Can I make a member of the public comment totally divorced from my panel 4 role, David?
Go right ahead.
Which is just, I would strongly encourage the subcommittee not to make a visitor policy beyond the confines of health and safety and COVID without a much more robust community process, because there are a lot of very strong feelings on that issue. So that, just putting that out there for consideration.
Any other thoughts from subcommittee members or from you, Susan, staff, anyone from the public?
I think my only comment would be, first of all, I agree with Dave Gashak's comment, just because I think there are a lot of crosswinds on that one in terms of school security, in terms of starting class on time, as Tricia said, in terms of health and safety, in terms of building community and making sure parents feel like it's their building and their school and they're deeply invested in it. So I completely agree on that one in terms of the broader conversation. The only thing I would say just on this one as well is that the communication is so important about, students not either experiencing real or perceived adverse consequences for staying home, and like what that means and what that looks like, and that we're offering them a robust enough experience so that not only is that our policy, but it's what's actually communicated to students by teachers and by parents. So there's kind of a cultural piece to that as well. So at any rate, I do think it's important to get some answers from DESE, but I also just think for when we put out the communication for both of these, I think the philosophy, the why is important so that people understand that the culturally what they would need to be conveying about why this is important to do. So at any rate, I'm not sure what our sequence is on communication. Actually, Tricia, you may know, or David, you may know, but Dave Proman, you may know, but I'm not. We have to sort of sort those messages out also.
Yes. All right, any further thoughts on this agenda item? Andy?
Just asking, what do you think our next steps ought to be, or about the 2 issues where we kind of took it up, but we're not sure what to do next, like attendance and whether to have visitors. I mean, the beginning of school is fast approaching, so if we were to have policies in place, it would have to be done quickly.
I think very
beginning to think about it.
I think very clearly we are going to need to have another policy subcommittee meeting before the start of school so that we can refer any such policies to the full school committee. But even before that can happen, it would be very important to have input from central office about what it is they're looking for, what the principals are going to be looking for. It sounds like Casey is actively having those conversations and will continue to have them. And as we learn more from Casey and from central office, we'll schedule another policy meeting for as soon as possible, because the school year is rapidly approaching.
Okay,
And
I
then
think maybe we should also just figure out which which things can just be settled by the superintendent without having to go through the cumbersome school committee deliberations, right? Like you said, David, that last year the no visitors policy, I guess we never voted that, right? It was something that Dr. Marini just did. And I don't think we objected, but it wasn't an action of ours. So, you know, if it's something like that, then the superintendent can be much more nimble than the school committee.
Potentially, and that can always be a consideration. My thinking, though, is as a general matter, it's a good idea for major practices to be baked into a codified policy, just so that there's greater predictability and the public can see what it is that they can and cannot do. That's sometimes easier than having communications go out that perhaps not everyone has easy access to, because our policies are posted on the website. Communications, depending on how they reach the public, aren't necessarily always out there. But yes, definitely, it's not necessarily something that we absolutely have to do. So we can have further discussions about whether we want to codify this into a policy or just leave that to the superintendent's discretion. And I think I would defer to I personally would defer to the superintendent's wishes on that issue.
I think the attendance during quarantine does seem to fall under the school committee's jurisdiction, but in order to sort of have any kind of sensible decision about that, we'll need to know in some details of what will actually be in place for students who have to quarantine. So I don't think we know that yet.
Yes. All right, so next up on our agenda item is new business. Would anyone like to raise some new business? Okay. Valerie, not to put you on the spot, but given that this is your very first meeting, do you have any closing words for us or anything you'd like us to explore and put on the agenda for our next meeting?
Not at this time, but I will certainly reach out.
Okay. All right, in that case, I think that concludes the meeting for this evening. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating. Thank you to you, Dave, and all the work that Panel 4 continues to undertake. It's really been a Herculean task, and we're very much indebted to you. And thank you to you, Tricia, and all the work you've been doing, to Casey, who had to sign off, but everyone's working hard, and it's very much appreciated. And thank you, members of the public, for tuning in and participating. And we'll be scheduling another policy meeting for sometime later in August. All right, that concludes this meeting. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.